In a courtroom ruled by logic and cold facts, a child dares to speak the impossible. "If you free my father, I'll make you walk," she declares to the paralyzed judge. Moments later, the courtroom watches him rise. That day, justice bowed to faith and everything changed. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. I promise that this will be the best story you will hear in your life. In the heart of Philadelphia, the Harrison County Courthouse stood as a monument to justice, or at least the appearance of it. Its marble columns and grand staircases whispered of fairness and impartiality, but Judge Robert Caldwell knew better. For 10 years, he had presided over this courtroom from his wheelchair, dispensing verdicts with unwavering rigidity. His body may have been paralyzed from the waist down, but his mind had become equally inflexible, a fortress against uncertainty, emotion, and anything that couldn't be measured by legal statutes. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor as the day's proceedings began. Case number 47293, the State versus Daniel Mitchell. The charges: corporate fraud and embezzlement. The evidence: seemingly overwhelming. The defense underfunded and overwhelmed. It was, by all appearances, another routine case moving through the machinery of justice. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Robert Caldwell," announced the bailiff, the irony of the phrase not lost on those familiar with the judge's condition. Robert wheeled himself to his position, nodding curtly to the courtroom. At 52, his once dark hair had silvered at the temples, and deep lines had etched themselves around his mouth, not from smiling, but from years of compressed determination. His eyes, a steely blue, surveyed the room with clinical detachment. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice resonating with authority earned through decades of service. As the proceedings began, Robert observed the defendant with practiced indifference. Daniel Mitchell, 45, well-dressed despite 6 months in county jail awaiting trial, with a face that betrayed both exhaustion and resilience. Just another face in an endless parade of the accused. District Attorney Victoria Sloan approached the bench with confident strides. Her reputation preceded her, ambitious, ruthless, with the highest conviction rate in the state. Her crimson blazer stood out in the sea of navy and gray suits like a drop of blood in water. "Your Honor," she began, "the state will prove beyond reasonable doubt that Mr. Mitchell systematically defrauded his company of over $2 million, betraying not only his employers but the community that trusted him." Robert nodded, already mentally cataloguing the case alongside countless others he'd presided over. Open and shut. Just follow the evidence, apply the law. Another day, another verdict. The defense attorney, James Williams, rose next. His suit was off the rack, his tie slightly askew. A public defender drowning in caseloads, fighting a battle he seemed destined to lose. "Your Honor," Williams began, his voice steady despite the odds, "my client maintains his innocence. The evidence against Mr. Mitchell is circumstantial at best, manipulated at worst. We intend to show that he's been made a scapegoat for corporate malfeasance that goes much higher." Robert suppressed a sigh. "Yeah, they always claimed innocence. They always had excuses." After a decade on the bench, and especially after the accident that took his mobility, he'd heard it all. The world was cleaner, simpler when divided into right and wrong, guilty and innocent, black and white. As the opening statements concluded, Robert announced a brief recess before testimony would begin. The courtroom emptied, but he remained, reviewing his notes with methodical precision. "Need anything, Judge?" asked Sarah, his clerk of 8 years. "No, thank you," he replied without looking up. But as she turned to leave, something compelled him to add, "Sarah, what's your impression of this case?" She paused, surprised by the unusual query. In 8 years, he'd never asked for her opinion on a case in progress. "Honestly, something feels off. The timeline doesn't quite add up, and some of the financial records seem—" She hesitated. "Seem what?" Robert pressed. "Convenient," she finished. "Too neat," Robert nodded dismissively. "Evidence is evidence. Feelings don't hold up in court." Sarah gave a tight smile. "Of course, Your Honor." As she left, Robert wheeled himself to the window overlooking the courthouse square. Below, people hurried about their lives, unaware of the decisions being made above that would alter destinies forever. He rarely questioned his judgments anymore. The accident had taken more than his ability to walk. It had taken his tolerance for ambiguity. In his pain and frustration, he'd found comfort in absolute certainty. The afternoon session progressed as expected. The prosecution presented financial records, witness testimonies, and a carefully constructed timeline of events that painted Daniel Mitchell as a calculating thief. The defense tried valiantly to poke holes in the narrative, but Robert could already see where this was heading. By day's end, the prosecution's case seemed airtight. As the court adjourned for the day, Robert noticed something unusual. In the back row, a young girl sat watching the proceedings with intense concentration. No more than 12 years old, with dark curly hair and eyes that seemed too knowing for her age. Children weren't typically allowed in his courtroom during trials. He made a mental note to speak to the bailiff about it tomorrow. That evening, as Robert's caretaker helped him into bed in his specially adapted colonial home just outside the city, his mind kept returning to the girl. There had been something familiar about her, something that tugged at his memory. "Everything all right, Judge?" asked Michael, his caretaker of 5 years. "Fine," Robert replied curtly, his standard response to any inquiry about his well-being. But that night, his dreams were anything but fine. He dreamed of the accident, the screeching tires, the impact, the doctors' faces as they delivered the prognosis. He dreamed of his wife leaving 2 years later, unable to bear his bitterness and rigidity. And for the first time in years, he dreamed of walking, striding down the courthouse steps, feeling the sun on his face without the barrier of wheels and metal. He awoke at 3 a.m., his body covered in sweat, his legs tingling with phantom sensation. For a moment, just before full consciousness claimed him, he could have sworn he felt his toes move, but that was impossible. The doctors had been clear. His paralysis was permanent. Morning came with grey skies and the promise of rain. As Robert prepared for court, he found himself thinking about Daniel Mitchell. Was there something he was missing? Was Sarah right about the evidence being too neat? "Don't be ridiculous," he muttered to himself as Michael helped him into his chair. "The evidence speaks for itself." But as his car navigated the rain-slicked streets toward the courthouse, doubt, that most unwelcome visitor, had already begun to take root in the mind of a man who had spent a decade banishing it. The second day of the trial began like any other. The rain drummed steadily against the courthouse windows, creating a somber soundtrack to the proceedings. Judge Caldwell listened as Victoria Sloan called her star witness, Eleanor Winters, the company's financial controller, who had first discovered the discrepancies in the accounts. Eleanor took the stand with practiced composure, her testimony flowing smoothly, too smoothly, Robert suddenly thought. It was as if she'd rehearsed every word, every pause, every gesture. Something about her confident assertions made the doubt in his mind grow stronger. "And you're certain these transactions were authorized solely by Mr. Mitchell?" asked James Williams during cross-examination, his voice sharp with sudden purpose. "Absolutely," Eleanor replied, not missing a beat. "No one else had access to that level of authorization. Yet the company's protocol requires 2 signatories for transactions over $50,000. How do you explain that?" For the first time, Eleanor hesitated. Mr. Mitchell circumvented the protocols. "How exactly?" Williams pressed. "The system doesn't allow it." "Objection, Your Honor," Sloan interjected. "Defense counsel is badgering the witness." Robert raised his hand. "Overruled. The witness will answer." Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. He must have found a way. The money is gone and all trails lead to him." Robert found himself leaning forward in his wheelchair. Something wasn't right. He'd presided over enough corporate fraud cases to know that financial systems rarely had loopholes that convenient. "Court will recess for lunch," he announced abruptly. "We'll reconvene at 1:30. As the courtroom emptied, Robert noticed the same young girl from yesterday sitting in the back row. This time their eyes met briefly before she slipped out with the crowd. There was something in her gaze, a mixture of hope and determination that stayed with him. During the recess, he asked Sarah to bring him the complete financial records from the case, not just the excerpts the prosecution had entered into evidence. It was an unusual request, but she complied without question. "Here you are, Judge," she said, placing the thick binder on his desk. "Everything from the last 3 fiscal years." Robert spent his lunch hour poring over the documents, his legal training and years of experience in financial cases allowing him to spot inconsistencies that others might miss. The more he read, the more his certainty wavered. The narrative was too clean, the evidence too perfectly aligned. In real-life financial crimes, there were always loose ends, contradictions, messiness. This case had none of that. As the bailiff called the court back to order, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the uncomfortable weight of responsibility. Not just to follow procedure, but to find the truth. The afternoon session had barely begun when the courtroom doors swung open. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery as the young girl Robert had noticed walked confidently down the center aisle. Before anyone could stop her, she approached the bench, her steps determined and unwavering. "Young lady, this is a courtroom in session," Robert said sternly. "You cannot be here." "I need to speak with you, Judge Caldwell," she replied, her voice steady despite her youth. "It's about my father." The courtroom fell silent. Robert looked from the girl to Daniel Mitchell, who had half risen from his seat, his face a mask of emotion. "Emma, no," Mitchell said, his voice breaking. "Please go back to Aunt Clara." "Your Honor," Victoria Sloane interjected, "this is highly irregular. The child should be removed immediately." Robert raised his hand for silence, his gaze fixed on the girl, Emma. "Who is your father?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Emma pointed at Daniel Mitchell. "Him, and he's innocent. Young lady, this court determines innocence or guilt based on evidence, not familial loyalty," Robert explained, his tone gentler than usual. "But you're not looking at all the evidence," Emma insisted. "You're only seeing what they want you to see." Robert sighed, preparing to call the bailiff when Emma spoke again, her words stopping time itself. "If you free my father, I'll make you walk again." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps. Some laughed nervously, others exchanged concerned glances. Robert himself felt a flash of anger at what seemed like a cruel joke. "Order!" he commanded, banging his gavel. "That's enough." "Bailiff, please escort—" "I'm not lying," Emma interrupted, stepping closer. "I know about your accident. I know the doctor said you'd never walk again. But they're wrong, just like they're wrong about my dad." Robert felt a chill run through him. How could this child know about his prognosis? He'd kept the details private, sharing them only with his medical team and closest family. "Your Honor," James Williams stood, "I apologize for my client's daughter. She's understandably upset about these proceedings." Robert nodded, composing himself. "Of course. Bailiff, please escort Miss Mitchell to the gallery. She may observe if she remains silent." As the bailiff guided Emma to a seat, Robert noticed Daniel Mitchell's expression, not embarrassment or frustration, but a kind of awe mixed with fear as he watched his daughter. It wasn't the look of a guilty man annoyed by his child's interference. It was something else entirely. The trial continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Robert found himself paying closer attention to the testimonies, noting contradictions and convenient explanations that he might have previously overlooked. The prosecution's case, which had seemed so solid yesterday, now revealed hairline fractures under scrutiny. During the final witness's testimony, Robert felt an odd sensation in his legs, a warmth he hadn't experienced since before the accident. He dismissed it as phantom feeling, a cruel trick of his nervous system. But as the warmth spread, intensifying into a tingling that traveled from his toes to his knees, he gripped the arms of his wheelchair in shock. No one noticed at first, all eyes on the witness stand. But as Robert shifted in his seat, feeling a strength return to muscles long dormant, Sarah glanced over. Her eyes widened as she saw his foot move ever so slightly against the footrest of his wheelchair. "Your Honor?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Robert met her gaze, his own filled with disbelief. The sensation continued to build, a wave of impossible feeling rushing through limbs that had been numb for a decade. He pressed his hand against his thigh, and for the first time in 10 years felt pressure in response. "Court will adjourn for today," he announced suddenly, his voice uncharacteristically unsteady. "We will reconvene tomorrow morning." As the courtroom emptied, Robert remained seated, afraid to test what seemed impossible. Only when the last person had left, except for Sarah, who stood nearby, concern etched on her face, Did he place his hands on the arms of his wheelchair and push? His legs, responding to commands they had ignored for a decade, supported his weight. Trembling with effort and emotion, Judge Robert Caldwell stood. "Sarah," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I can feel my legs." Sarah rushed to his side, steadying him as he took one shaky step, then another. "This is impossible," she breathed. Robert's mind raced back to Emma's words, "If you free my father, I'll make you walk again." But how could a child have such power? It defied all logic, all medical science, all rational explanation. As he lowered himself back into the wheelchair, exhausted from the effort but electrified by possibility, his eyes caught sight of a small figure, watching through the crack in the courtroom doors. Emma smiled, not with triumph but with a wisdom far beyond her years, before disappearing down the corridor. That night, as Michael helped him into bed, Robert didn't mention what had happened. He was afraid to speak it aloud, as if words might break whatever spell had been cast. After Michael left, he sat up and swung his legs over the side of the bed. They moved in response to his will, clumsy and weak from disuse, but undeniably mobile. He stood beside his bed, holding onto the nightstand for support, and took 5 tentative steps before his strength gave out. As he fell back onto the mattress, tears of joy and confusion flooded his eyes. The impossible had happened, but why? How? More importantly, what did it mean for Daniel Mitchell's case? If Emma could perform miracles, what else might be true that seemed impossible? The evidence that had appeared so conclusive now seemed suspect in light of the inexplicable. For the first time in 10 years, Judge Robert Caldwell fell asleep without the bitter taste of resignation on his tongue. Instead, he dreamed of walking through fields of possibility, each step taking him further from the rigid certainties that had defined his life since the accident. Morning arrived with clarity Robert hadn't experienced in years. He'd spent half the night practicing walking in the privacy of his bedroom, marveling at the miracle while simultaneously questioning his own sanity. By dawn, he could traverse the length of his room without support, though his muscles trembled with the effort of relearning their purpose. "You seem different today, Judge," Michael commented as he helped Robert dress in his judicial robes, oblivious to the transformation that had occurred. Robert had decided to keep his wheelchair for now, partly because his legs were still weak, but mainly because he wasn't ready to explain what defied explanation. "Just focused on today's proceedings," Robert replied, but inside his mind was racing. The case against Daniel Mitchell now seemed riddled with inconsistencies. What if Emma was right? What if they were all seeing only what someone wanted them to see? As his car approached the courthouse, Robert made a decision. "Take me to the evidence lockup first," he instructed his driver. "There's something I need to verify before court begins." The evidence clerk was surprised to see the judge personally inspecting case materials, but Robert's reputation for thoroughness prevented any questions. Alone in the examination room, he spread out the financial records, the complete versions, not just the excerpts presented in court. For 2 hours, he meticulously traced the money trail, following each transaction to its source. What he found stunned him. Subtle inconsistencies in the audit timestamps, metadata that didn't match the purported timeline, and most damningly, evidence of document manipulation that had been expertly concealed. "Judge Caldwell?" Sarah's voice interrupted his concentration. "Court was scheduled to begin 15 minutes ago." Robert looked up. The evidence of tampering spread before him. "Sarah, I need you to contact the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit immediately, quietly. Tell them I need a forensic analysis of these documents by this afternoon." Sarah's eyes widened as she glanced at his notes. "You think the evidence was falsified?" "I think we've been led down a very specific path," Robert replied, gathering the documents, "and I intend to find out why." When court finally convened an hour behind schedule, Robert's demeanor had changed noticeably. The gallery whispered about his delayed arrival, but fell silent as he began speaking. "Before we continue with scheduled testimony, I have several questions for Ms. Winters," he announced, referring to the financial controller who had testified the previous day. The clerk will recall the witness. Eleanor Winters returned to the stand, her composure intact, but her eyes betraying concern at this unexpected development. "Ms. Winters," Robert began, "yesterday you testified that only Mr. Mitchell had authorization for these transactions. Yet the company's own policy manual, which I reviewed this morning, clearly states that transactions above $50,000 require dual authentication. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Eleanor shifted in her seat. "As I mentioned, Mr. Mitchell found a way to circumvent the system, so you claim," Robert continued. "Yet the system logs show no evidence of circumvention. What they do show," he held up a printout from his morning's investigation, "is that your credentials were used alongside Mr. Mitchell's for every transaction in question." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Victoria Sloane stood quickly. "Your Honor, this evidence wasn't part of discovery. The defense hasn't had—" "Actually, Miss Sloane," Robert interrupted, "these logs were included in the original evidence submitted to the court. They simply weren't highlighted in the prosecution's presentation." "I find that curious." Eleanor's face had paled. "There must be some mistake." "Perhaps," Robert acknowledged. "But there's another inconsistency I'd like you to address. The audit report dates these transactions between January and March, yet the metadata on the files indicates they were created in April, after the alleged discovery of the fraud. Can you explain that?" The courtroom fell completely silent. Eleanor looked to District Attorney Sloane, who had gone rigid in her seat. I can't explain that," Eleanor finally admitted. "Your Honor," James Williams rose from the defense table, clearly trying to keep pace with this unexpected turn. "In light of these revelations, the defense moves for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client." "Not so fast, Counselor," Robert replied. "I've requested a forensic analysis of all evidence in this case by the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Until we have their findings, this trial is in recess." He struck his gavel with finality. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." As people filed out of the courtroom, Robert noticed Emma sitting beside an older woman who must have been the Aunt Clara Mitchell had mentioned. The girl caught his eye and smiled, not with smugness, but with a simple, knowing gratitude that made his chest tighten. Later that afternoon in his chambers, Robert received the preliminary report from the FBI. The evidence was damning. The financial records had indeed been manipulated, transaction dates altered, and audit logs modified. But the most shocking revelation was who had accessed the files last, Victoria Sloane herself, using a terminal in the district attorney's office. As Robert absorbed this information, a knock came at his door. Sarah entered, her face grave. "Judge, there's something else you should see." She handed him a sealed envelope. "This was delivered by courier from the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee. It's marked urgent and confidential." Inside was a dossier containing evidence of a pattern. Victoria Sloane had pursued multiple high-profile cases with manipulated evidence over the past 3 years. The Ethics Committee had been building a case against her, working quietly to avoid compromising ongoing investigations. Daniel Mitchell's case was just the latest in a disturbing series. But why target Mitchell specifically? The answer came buried in the financial analysis. Mitchell had discovered irregularities in his company's charitable foundation, a foundation whose board included several prominent political figures, including the current state governor who had appointed Sloane to her position. "My God," Robert whispered. Mitchell hadn't stolen anything. He'd been about to expose corruption at the highest levels. Another knock at the door revealed FBI agent Dawson, lead investigator for the Financial Crimes Unit. "Judge Caldwell," Dawson began without preamble, "we've found enough evidence to issue arrest warrants for Victoria Sloane and Eleanor Winters on charges of evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. We believe they were working to frame Mr. Mitchell to prevent him from exposing a significant embezzlement scheme involving the company's charitable foundation." Robert nodded, the pieces falling into place. "Have the warrants been executed?" "That's the problem," Dawson replied grimly. "Sloane has disappeared. She cleared out her office an hour ago and isn't answering her phone. Winters is also unreachable." Robert's blood ran cold. "Daniel Mitchell and his daughter, are they safe?" Dawson's expression darkened. "We have officers en route to their location now." Robert stood suddenly, startling both Sarah and Agent Dawson. Neither commented on the fact that the supposedly paralyzed judge was now standing on his own 2 feet. I need to go there immediately, Robert insisted, reaching for his coat. Judge, this is a matter for law enforcement, Dawson objected. That girl and her father were in my courtroom, Robert countered, his voice firm. I almost condemned an innocent man because I didn't look closely enough at the evidence. I won't fail them again. 20 minutes later, Robert's car pulled up outside a modest suburban home where Daniel Mitchell had been staying with his sister Clara and daughter Emma since being released on bail. FBI agents were already securing the perimeter, but the front door stood ajar. A bad sign. Despite protests from his driver and the agents outside, Robert approached the house. His legs, stronger with each passing hour, carried him up the front steps with only minor difficulty. Inside, he found Agent Dawson in the living room with Daniel Mitchell, Clara, and Emma. All appeared shaken, but unharmed. Judge Caldwell. Mitchell stood in surprise. You're walking. It's a recent development, Robert replied dryly, relief washing over him at seeing them safe. What happened here? Victoria Sloane, Mitchell explained, his arm protectively around Emma's shoulders. She came here ranting about how I'd ruined everything. She had a gun, but Clara managed to call 911 before she could. He trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought in front of his daughter. The local police apprehended her 3 blocks from here, Dawson added. She's in custody now. Robert knelt before Emma, meeting her at eye level. You knew, didn't you? About all of this? Emma nodded solemnly. I overheard Dad talking on the phone about the missing money from the Children's Foundation. Then when he was arrested, I found his notes. I knew he wouldn't take anything, especially not from sick kids. And me? Robert asked softly. How did you know about my condition? Emma's eyes, wise beyond her years, held his. I researched you when Dad was arrested. I read about your accident and... She hesitated, glancing at her father. And? Robert prompted gently. I prayed, she said simply. Every night. I prayed for a miracle, for you to see the truth and for you to walk again. I told God I'd believe forever if he'd just help my dad. The simplicity of her faith struck Robert deeply. Was it possible? A miracle in response to a child's pure belief? Or had his paralysis always had a psychological component, as one doctor had once suggested? His mind refusing what his body might still be capable of. Perhaps it didn't matter. What mattered was that an innocent man would now go free. Corruption would be exposed. And somewhere in the midst of it all, Judge Robert Caldwell had rediscovered something he'd lost long before his accident. Faith in the possibility of truth and justice beyond what could be measured and catalogued. The next morning, Judge Robert Caldwell entered his courtroom walking on his own 2 feet. A collective gasp rose from the gallery as he made his way to the bench without his wheelchair. The news crews that had gathered to cover the sensational developments in the Mitchell case now had an even more extraordinary story unfolding before them. Be seated, Robert commanded, his voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. The courtroom settled into an expectant silence. In light of evidence that has come to my attention and the subsequent investigation by federal authorities, all charges against Daniel Mitchell are hereby dismissed. He struck his gavel with authority. Mr. Mitchell, you are free to go with the court's sincerest apologies for this miscarriage of justice. Daniel Mitchell embraced his daughter, who sat beside him at the defense table. Tears streamed down his face as he held Emma close, whispering words of gratitude that only she could hear. Furthermore, Robert continued, I am ordering an immediate review of all cases prosecuted by District Attorney Victoria Sloane over the past 5 years. Any defendants convicted in these cases may petition for a new trial if they believe evidence may have been compromised. The announcement sent ripples of shock through the courtroom. Such a sweeping order was unprecedented. Court is adjourned, Robert concluded, striking his gavel a final time. As the courtroom emptied, Emma approached the bench, her father close behind. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, her young voice clear and confident. Robert stepped down from the bench to meet her. I believe I should be thanking you. Emma, you showed remarkable courage coming into my courtroom that day. I just knew my dad was innocent, she replied simply. And you were right. Robert extended his hand to Daniel Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell, I owe you an apology. I nearly failed in my duty as a judge, because I'd forgotten that justice requires more than following procedures. It requires wisdom and discernment. Mitchell shook his hand firmly. You found the truth, Judge, that's what matters. Dad's going to make sure all the money gets back to the Children's Foundation, Emma added proudly. He says those kids need it more than anyone. Robert smiled. I have no doubt he will. He hesitated before asking the question that had haunted him since that extraordinary moment in the courtroom. Emma, about what happened to me, do you truly believe you caused it? Emma looked up at him with those wise, knowing eyes. I didn't do anything, Judge Caldwell. I just believed it was possible. Sometimes that's enough to make miracles happen. Her words stayed with Robert long after they had gone. That evening, alone in his home office, he drafted his resignation from the bench. Not as an admission of failure, but as recognition that he needed time to rediscover the foundations of justice he had lost sight of over the years. As he sealed the envelope containing his resignation, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Judge Caldwell speaking, he answered. Judge, this is Dr. Eliza Chen from Philadelphia General. I treated you after your accident 10 years ago. Robert sat up straighter. Yes, Dr. Chen, what can I do for you? I've been hearing some remarkable things, she said carefully, about your recovery. I'd like to see you if possible. There's something you should know. The next morning, Robert sat in Dr. Chen's office, his resignation letter still in his briefcase, undelivered. The neurologist sat across from him, a thick medical file open on her desk. I've reviewed all your records, she began, including the original scans from after your accident. What I'm about to tell you should have been shared years ago, but there were complications. Robert leaned forward. What kind of complications? Dr. Chen sighed. Your spinal injury was severe, but not necessarily permanent. There was significant trauma and inflammation compressing your spinal cord, but the cord itself wasn't severed. With proper treatment and rehabilitation, you might have regained some function. Why wasn't I told this? Robert asked, his voice tight with emotion. Because someone made sure those findings never reached you. She slid a document across the desk. This is a memo from the hospital's legal department, dated 1 week after your accident. It references potential litigation against the State Transportation Department for negligent road maintenance at the site of your accident. Robert scanned the document, his legal mind quickly grasping its implications. They suppressed my prognosis to increase potential damages. Not just that, Dr. Chen continued. There was pressure from higher up. Your accident occurred on a stretch of highway that had been repeatedly flagged for dangerous conditions. The state had ignored those warnings for years. If it became public knowledge that a judge had been injured due to their negligence, it would have been a political disaster, Robert finished, the pieces falling into place. So instead they made sure I believed my condition was irreversible, and recommended a treatment approach unlikely to yield improvement, Dr. Chen added grimly. I was fresh out of residency then, not the attending physician. By the time I reviewed your case and noticed the discrepancies, you'd already settled with the state and moved on. Robert sat back, absorbing this revelation. For 10 years, he'd lived with a conviction that was, at its core, fabrication, much like the case he'd nearly decided against Daniel Mitchell. So Emma's miracle may have been your body finally overcoming years of psychological barriers, Dr. Chen suggested. The mind is powerful, Judge Caldwell. Once you believed recovery was possible, truly believed it, your body might have finally responded to neural pathways that had always remained intact. Robert thought of Emma's words. I just believed it was possible. Sometimes that's enough to make miracles happen. Doctor, he said finally, who ordered my prognosis to be withheld? Dr. Chen hesitated. The directive came from the governor's office, specifically from the governor's chief counsel at the time. And who was that? A woman named Victoria Sloan. The connection struck Robert like lightning. Victoria Sloan, the same woman who had nearly sent Daniel Mitchell to prison on fabricated charges, the same woman who had been protecting corrupt officials for years, had been involved in his case from the beginning. She knew, Robert whispered. All these years prosecuting cases in my courtroom, she knew what they'd done to me. There's more, Dr. Chen added, opening another file. The investigation into your accident was closed prematurely. A report suggests your car's brake lines may have been tampered with. Robert stared at her in shock. "Are you suggesting my accident wasn't an accident at all?" "I'm suggesting there are too many coincidences," she replied carefully. "You were presiding over a case involving state contracts at the time, contracts that later went to companies with ties to the governor's campaign donors. The world Robert thought he knew was unraveling around him. His accident, his paralysis, the years of bitterness and rigid adherence to rules, all potentially stemming from corruption, he'd been too blind to see. Instead of delivering his resignation that afternoon, Robert met with FBI agent Dawson. The evidence Dr. Chen had preserved would open a new and far-reaching investigation into corruption at the highest levels of state government. 1 week later, as news of the widening corruption probe dominated headlines, Robert received a visitor at his home. Daniel Mitchell stood on his doorstep, looking hesitant but determined. "Mr. Mitchell," Robert greeted him, stepping aside to invite him in. "This is unexpected." "I hope I'm not intruding," Mitchell replied, entering the foyer. "I wanted to thank you personally, away from the courthouse and cameras." Robert led him to the living room, his gait growing stronger with each passing day. "No thanks necessary. I was simply doing my job, belatedly perhaps, but doing it nonetheless." Mitchell smiled. "Emma says you're too hard on yourself. Your daughter is remarkably perceptive," Robert acknowledged. "How is she handling all this attention?" "Better than I am," Mitchell admitted. "She's already talking about becoming a judge someday. Says the system needs more people who believe in miracles and truth." Robert laughed, a genuine laugh that felt foreign to his lips after so many years. "I suspect she'd make an excellent judge." Mitchell's expression grew serious. "I also came because I heard about what they did to you, about your accident and the cover-up. I'm so sorry." "It seems we were both victims of the same corruption," Robert replied. "The difference is, you never lost faith in the truth. I did for a very long time." "What will you do now?" Mitchell asked. "Will you return to the bench?" Robert considered the question that had occupied his thoughts for days. "Eventually, yes. But first I'm taking a leave of absence. There's someone I need to reconnect with." That evening, Robert sat on his porch, phone in hand, gathering courage for a call he should have made years ago. Finally, he dialed the number. "Hello?" Came a familiar voice that still made his heart skip even after all this time. "Catherine," he said softly. "It's Robert. I know it's been a long time, but I've changed. In ways I can hardly explain. And I was hoping we could talk." There was a pause, and then, "I saw you on the news, Robert, standing, walking." Another pause. "I always told you miracles were possible, didn't I?" "You did," he acknowledged, remembering their arguments after the accident, her faith versus his bitter pragmatism. "I should have listened to you then." "I'm listening now." 2 months later, Judge Robert Caldwell returned to the Harrison County Courthouse. He walked up the grand staircase without assistance, nodding to colleagues and citizens who still marveled at his recovery. The corruption investigation had led to numerous resignations and arrests, including several judges whose cases were now being reviewed for similar manipulation. As he prepared to enter his courtroom, he spotted Emma and Daniel Mitchell in the corridor. They had come to observe his first day back on the bench. Emma wore a future judge t-shirt that made Robert smile. "Ready to dispense some real justice today, Judge Caldwell?" Emma asked with her characteristic directness. "I'm certainly going to try," he replied honestly. "It's more complicated than I once thought." "That's why you need both," she said, tapping her head and then her heart. "These have to work together." As Robert took his place at the bench, he looked out at the courtroom with new eyes. Catherine sat in the gallery, having returned to give their relationship a second chance. Sarah stood ready at her clerk's station, proud to continue serving with a judge who had rediscovered his humanity. And in the back row, Emma watched with expectant hope, the kind of hope that could make the impossible possible. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Judge Robert Caldwell, once rigid, now humbled, once broken, now healing, picked up his gavel and began again, guided by both the law and something greater, the belief that truth and justice, like miracles, required not just evidence but faith. Dear listeners, we hope Judge Caldwell's journey of transformation has touched your hearts as deeply as Emma's unwavering faith transformed his life. Sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the physical ones we can see, but the renewal of hope and belief in what's right. If this story of justice, faith, and second chances moved you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on this video. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to life. Have you ever experienced a moment where believing made the impossible possible? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to check out our special playlist of redemption stories by clicking the link to your left. Until our next story, remember that sometimes the greatest healing begins when we open ourselves to possibilities beyond what we can prove.